Dr. Alexandre Castro was a dedicated scientist, known in the world of biotechnology for his genius and his relentless pursuit of innovations that could transform medicine. Working in a high-tech research laboratory, he was leading a secret project that he believed could revolutionize human life. After years of experiments and tests, Alexandre had finally achieved what he called a fundamental discovery, a technology capable of manipulating human DNA in unprecedented and precise ways. What he had created could eradicate genetic diseases, extend human life, and even enhance a person's physical and mental capabilities. The promise of a future where death from incurable diseases would be a thing of the past seemed within his grasp. However, as the discovery took shape, Alexander could not help but feel increasingly uneasy. He knew that the implications of his invention would not only be scientific, but also moral and social. If governments or corporations had access to this technology, who would decide who could and could not improve their genetics? Furthermore, would it be ethical to modify human DNA in such a radical way, without knowing all the long-term consequences? Questions began to swirl in his mind, and the initial excitement of the discovery gave way to the weight of a growing moral dilemma. He held in his hands the power to alter the very nature of humanity, but it did not make him feel any more powerful. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more he feared the possible repercussions. During a meeting with his research team, Alexandre finally voiced his concerns. "We are about to make history, but I can't help but wonder, what happens when science crosses ethical boundaries?" he asked, visibly tense. His assistant, Lucas, who was younger and more idealistic, didn't hesitate to answer. "If technology can save lives, then we need to use it. Advances are inevitable, and who are we to stop something that can eliminate human suffering?" But Alexandre wasn't convinced. The prospect of a genetic elite being formed where only the most powerful or privileged could access genetic enhancements deeply disturbed him. He knew that science should be used for the common good, but the line between progress and abuse of power seemed too thin. Over the next few days, Alexandre began exploring alternatives, trying to find a way to ensure that his invention would be used in an ethical and controlled manner. He sought guidance from philosophers and bioethicists, discussing the potential dangers of his creation. It was then that he met Sophia, a respected bioethicist and university professor, who, upon hearing Alexandre's explanation, expressed immediate concern. "You are creating something that could alter the very definition of what it means to be human," she warned. "What happens to those who do not have access to this technology? And more importantly, what happens to those who may be forced to use it not by choice, but by social or political pressure?" Sophia believed that Alexandre's discovery, while promising, carried with it a risk that could be even more devastating than the diseases it sought to cure. Despite Sophia's concerns, Alexandre was determined to continue his research, but this time with more caution. He spent weeks trying to understand how he could incorporate safety and ethical measures into his invention. However, as the discussions deepened, a disturbing idea began to take shape in his mind. What if science, instead of being the solution for humanity, was used as a tool of control? He remembered governments and large corporations that often used technological advances to consolidate power, and the nightmare of his discovery being used as a means of oppression haunted him. The repercussions of his invention could go beyond physical modifications. Genetic manipulation could also alter intellectual characteristics, creating an even greater divide between social classes, creating a world where the elites would be genetically superior. Alexander found himself in a moral predicament. His desire to save lives and improve people's well-being was being confronted by a cruel reality. Any advances he made could be distorted, manipulated for selfish ends. The next night, he had a vivid nightmare in which he saw a divided society, where only the enhanced had a voice, and the non-modified were treated as second-class citizens, marginalized and deprived of opportunities. Faced with this dilemma, Alexandre decided to do something unthinkable. He destroyed all research related to genetic manipulation and closed the laboratory, refusing to continue with the project. However, in an act of desperation, Lucas, Alexandre's assistant, made a decision that would change everything. Defying his boss's authority, and in secret, he made a copy of all the data and sent it to a group of scientists in another part of the world. Lucas believed that the project should go ahead, regardless of the consequences. Science should not be held back by fears and ethical dilemmas, Lucas thought. The future of humanity needs this change. Alexandra, upon discovering the betrayal, was devastated. He felt powerless in the face of the fact that his discovery, even without his authorization, could now be used without any kind of control. As the research spread to other parts of the world, enormous pressure was placed on governments and companies to fund and apply the discoveries. Alexander was approached by powerful politicians and businessmen who wanted to accelerate the implementation of the invention for economic and military purposes. But the scientist was now even more torn. He feared that the invention, although it had great potential, would be used irresponsibly. He knew that his creation could cure genetic diseases, but he also knew that it could be used to create a superior class of human beings, pushing the less fortunate even further to the margins of society. The responsibility for deciding the course of humanity now fell on his shoulders, and he felt the weight of this choice overwhelming. With pressure mounting from all sides, Alexander retreated to a secluded cabin in the mountains, determined to make a decision about the future of his invention. He could no longer sleep, and his nights were filled with turbulent thoughts. He knew that the stakes were much greater than himself or his research. He was on the brink of a point of no return. The idea that his discovery could revolutionize medicine and eradicate countless genetic diseases seemed wonderful. But on the other hand, the risks of abuse were immense. How could he ensure that humanity would not use the power of his invention for selfish and destructive purposes? One night, when he was overcome by insomnia, he remembered a conversation with his former mentor, Dr. Alice Duarte, a renowned bioethicist who had always defended the principle that science should serve the common good and not the interests of a few. He thought of her words, "Science has the power to heal, but it also has the power to destroy. What you discover does not belong to you alone. It carries with it an immense responsibility. You must have the courage to resist the temptation to be the savior of humanity." Those words echoed in his mind, challenging him to reconsider his position. He had already created something that could save lives, but also something that could destroy the social fabric and exacerbate the inequalities he so condemned. The next morning, Alexandra decided to convene a scientific ethics panel to review his invention. He knew that the only way to move forward with his invention would be with strict oversight and global regulation to ensure that his work was not distorted. If it were possible to use his discovery ethically, perhaps there would be a chance to minimize the harm. He contacted Dr. Alice Duarte, asking her to convene an international team of scientists, philosophers, religious leaders, and economists to discuss the moral implications of his invention. It was the only way to try to find a balance between the benefits of science and the preservation of human values. But once the group was formed, disagreements soon arose. Scientists were eager to test the possibilities of the invention without limitations, believing that any restrictions would be an obstacle to progress. Philosophers and religious leaders raised questions about human nature and the dangers of tinkering with something so fundamental. Meanwhile, large corporations and governments were pushing for the invention to be approved quickly, wanting to use the discovery as a geopolitical and economic advantage. Alexander felt powerless in a situation where everyone seemed to have their own interests at stake, and he, the creator of the invention, seemed to be losing control over something that should have been his responsibility. As the debate raged on, Alexander found himself caught between the differing views surrounding him. He began to question the very nature of his invention. Why did he feel so certain that it should be developed without fully considering the risks involved? Was it possible to create something that would be both safe and ethical for all humanity? The questions echoed in his mind, and he felt increasingly unable to choose a clear path. The pressure was mounting, but at the same time, he knew that the answers could not be taken lightly. The fear of being remembered as the scientist who brought doom to the world tormented him. One night, after yet another tense meeting with the ethics committee, Alexandra retreated alone to the laboratory where the invention was stored. He looked at the data he had collected, the tests he had performed, the promising results that indicated that his research could, in fact, eradicate genetic diseases that had killed millions of people. But at the same time, he remembered the faces of the victims of past experiments, of irresponsible scientists who had crossed boundaries in the name of progress. He thought of the eugenics experiments of the past, and the genetic manipulation that, if left unchecked, could generate a dystopian future. At that moment, something deep within him shifted. Instead of continuing to push his invention forward, as he had done up until then, he began to see the potential negative effects more clearly. His discovery could be used to create a class of enhanced humans, but this would not solve the problems of inequality. In fact, it could further exacerbate social disparities, creating a new form of discrimination where the unenhanced would be marginalized and stigmatized. How could he, as a scientist, be responsible for creating an even deeper divide between the rich and the poor? He was now more aware of the enormous power that science had to alter not only human biology, but also the social and political structures of the world. The next morning, with the weight of these new discoveries weighing heavily on his conscience, Alexandra sought out Dr. Alice Duarte again, seeking advice. He knew that the decision he would make in the coming days would forever change the course of history. "I have created something wonderful, but in doing so, I have created a monster," he said, his voice breaking. Dr. Alice, who had always believed in the power of science, but also in the moral limitations of human knowledge, placed her hand on his shoulder. "The real responsibility, Alexandra, is not to discover what science can do, but to ask whether humanity should actually do it. What is morally possible may not be morally acceptable." Alexander, now more certain of his doubt, knew that the moment of decision was approaching. He had begun to see the social impact of his discovery in a way he had never considered before. At a board meeting, he expressed his concerns, but was met with resistance. Many board members were eager to exploit the invention for profit and power. Some even argued that without the application of his research, modern medicine would be left behind. They did not see the moral dilemmas as a real obstacle, but as a barrier that could be overcome. As external pressure mounted, Alexandra became more isolated, secluded in his laboratory, reflecting on the responsibility that his work entailed. He began to draw comparisons with scientists of the past, who had pursued great discoveries without considering the consequences. The use of radiation, experiments with stem cells, indiscriminate genetic manipulation. Progress had its price, but he knew that this did not justify the damage caused to millions of lives. So he began to research more deeply the historical impact of scientific innovations that had been implemented without due ethical reflection, such as the abuse of genetic data on vulnerable populations. At a point of clarity, he had a vision. The real revolution would not be creating something that could cure all diseases, but rather finding ways to prevent human pain without resorting to biological manipulation. What if, instead of altering a person's genetics, science could focus on education, public policy, and access to healthcare for all? He realized that he could use his knowledge to promote these changes, rather than inventing a technology that could be distorted and misused. But the board was adamant. They threatened to cut off his funding, accusing him of backtracking on a potentially life-saving discovery. The pressure was taking a toll on Alexander. He knew that by rejecting his invention, he was going against a system that fed big pharmaceutical corporations and private interests. But his conscience told him he was doing the right thing. That's when he began making plans to destroy his research data, to protect the world from a future he didn't believe was ethical. Before taking action, Alexandra ran one last test, a final study of the implications of his invention on a small group of volunteers. He wanted to make sure that his decision was based on solid evidence. The result was devastating. Even with the best intentions, the genetic modification caused unexpected side effects, resulting in diseases that he could not foresee. It was proof that science could not control all the variables of nature. The discovery, which he had initially seen as the solution to so many problems, was nothing more than a double-edged sword. With that, Alexandra made his final decision. He destroyed all the data, erasing all the progress he had made, but not before leaving a letter for Dr. Alice, explaining his choice. He knew that his work would be a failure in the eyes of the world, but for him, it had been the only possible choice. As he closed the laboratory door and walked out into an uncertain future, he felt that for the first time in months, he breathed a sigh of relief. Ethics, once again, had prevailed.